This is the Cycling Over 60 podcast, Season 4, Episode 7, DeSalvo Custom Bicycles, and I'm your host, Tom Butler. One of the dynamics of having a podcast is that when I have a problem, I see it as an opportunity to share possible solutions with all of you. Of course, I would love to not be having problems, but there's value in learning how to fix something and then sharing it. My current problem that I'd love to fix is my Achilles tendon. For a month now, I've been trying to get it to not be so sore. Just when I think it's getting better, something happens and there's a setback. Recently, I was on the roof putting up Christmas lights, and I really aggravated my Achilles. The bad thing is that when I was on the roof, I didn't notice that it was getting stressed. It was only later, after not moving for a while, that the pain set in. Because of my Achilles problem, I've been afraid to go on long rides. I feel like if I get a long way from home and it flares up, I'll do a lot of damage because I need to ride back home. I'm actively seeking strategies for dealing with the issue. I know it's going to take a long time to heal, and I can't continue to avoid long rides, so I need to find a different way of rehabbing the tendon while still riding. One of the things I'm going to try is I'm going to stay seated for a while and see if that helps. I don't spend a lot of time standing up on the pedals, but I do like to go hard out of the saddle for short climbs just to stress my legs in a different way. I hope by staying seated and really focusing on good pedaling technique, that will help relieve some stress. The one thing that I've really found to be helpful is using KT tape. Following the instructions from the KT Achilles YouTube video, I run a strip from midway on the bottom of my foot to a little way up my calf. Then I put 2 half strips perpendicular to the full strip, one below the ankle and one above. This seems like it really helps to support the tendon. For some reason, I didn't think the tape up before I got on the roof, and that was a big mistake. There are different kinds of KT tape. Our family has always used the original cotton tape, but recently I purchased the KT Tape Pro. They say it is ultra-breathable synthetic fabric. I was attracted to that. But I don't think that it stays on as well as the cotton. Now, there are a ton of other types of KT tape, but I don't know anything about them. I have a really hard time putting the tape on myself. I don't seem to get it tensioned right. Kelly usually helps me, and I consider her a pro at it. But when she's not around, it is a problem. I started looking for a different solution to the tape. I started looking for a sleeve that I can put on my foot instead of the tape. I ended up purchasing a ProTech Athletics Achilles sleeve from REI. I haven't tried it out yet, but I'm hoping that wearing the sleeve will give the same benefit as the KT tape. Next month, I'm going to be walking around at a conference for 3 days. I'm worried I'm going to be repeatedly aggravating my Achilles at the conference if I don't have something. So either the sleeve works or I'm going to have to get better at applying the KT tape myself. Of course, the big issue here remains my lack of flexibility. I've just got to get really serious about changing that limitation. By looking back at habit change strategies I've talked about that have worked for me before, I know I need a routine. So here it is. I eat at 7 a.m. every morning, then 20 minutes on the trainer. That burns off breakfast and warms up my muscles. And then I do a 15-minute flexibility session. So I've done this 4 out of the last 6 days, but I haven't always managed to get it in right at breakfast time. So I'd give myself a score of 80 out of 100 so far. I'll put a link to the video that I'm doing in the show notes. It's a 15-minute post-workout stretch by Kaylee Cohen. But as far as I can see, there are a ton of good options out there. As I expected, I'm not even close to being able to do the stretching like instructed, but I'm going to keep working at it. In a recent episode, I mentioned that I wish there was some measurement that I could do around flexibility, because numbers really do help motivate me. I'm still working on that, but I do have some ideas. A couple other items I want to update you on. First, I picked up a new bike. This is my gravel, touring, and cyclocross bike. You might be wondering exactly how it can be all those things. I'll answer that question in a future podcast. If you're curious to see the bike, you can find a new bike day video on the Cycling Over 60 Instagram. I'm going to be breaking down everything about the bike, and I'm going to do something new and make a video about it. You'll be able to find the video on YouTube or listen to the audio where you normally get your episodes. The Cycling Over 60 YouTube is at Cycling Over 60. You need to include the @ sign when you're searching. And finally, I have a new Cycling Over 60 collaboration that I'm extremely excited about. I can't say anything about it right now, but I believe my vision of having Cycling Over 60 be a big help to people wanting to get or stay fit through cycling is going to be really improved by this collaboration. There is a lot to work through to bring this together, so stay tuned. Erin Eli came on the podcast on March 29th. She talked about her bike and Mike DeSalvo, who made it for her. She recommended that I bring Mike on the podcast, so I reached out to him. At that time, Mike let me know that he was slammed with bikes to make, but to try him again later. So I did reach out again, and I feel really fortunate to be able to have him share about his years as a frame maker here on the podcast. Just a heads up, I was recording the conversation over the phone, which is different for me. However, I think the quality doesn't really get in the way. Here is our conversation. I have the pleasure of being joined by Mike DeSalvo today. Thanks for coming on, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
I love the art and science of the bicycle. I see it as just this great machine. It is so inspiring. And so I'm really excited to have a conversation with you as the owner of DeSalvo Custom Bikes.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start out with a question that I like to start out with. And what is your earliest memory of the bicycle?
Probably my earliest memory was as a kid. I grew up in rural Northern California, really rural, just almost on the Oregon border. And we all rode, that was in the late 70s and 80s. And we rode our 20-inch bikes, our BMX bikes. And we were on those things from sunup to sundown, and we were jumping them and just having a ball. So that was where everything started for me, for sure.
To me, that picture of kids being outdoors on BMX bikes, I just think that's such a great picture.
Mm-hmm.
I like to see that, and I like to see some of the bike tracks that are springing up around.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I have kids, and it's these next generations. It's a different world. We lived to just get up and get on our bikes every day. And then of course we didn't want to come in at night.
Yeah.
So, and whether it was, and I can remember riding our BMX bikes. Oh, I had a friend that lived a ways out of school, so it was really novel for us to ride the 3 or 4 miles to school some mornings, and and even bigger trips, 7, 8, 10 miles on BMX bikes. We didn't know any better, so we just did it.
Right. My understanding is that you've been building custom bikes in Ashland, Oregon for over 20 years now. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm sneaking up. February of 1999 was when I built my first bike. So
okay.
I'm sneaking up on 27 years. So yeah, it's been a wild ride. I was 26 when I started. I'm 53 now. So it's been a long one already.
Looking back, what first drew you to frame building?
So, I guess I would take even a step farther back. And I'm one of those kids that, I kind of grew up in the bike shop. And I was the freshman in high school when I first got my job in the bike shop. And, it was fixing flat tires and sweeping the floor and things like that. So I worked in a bike shop all through high school. We had a work experience program where, you could go to school half of the day, and basically working was your elective. So I did that. And then after I graduated, I took classes at United Bicycle Institute, and I spent some time in Colorado and continued to work in bike shops. I think that time, that was the early 90s, and the mountain bike boom was happening, and I was pretty smitten, with the Ritchie bikes and the Bontraggers and the Breezers and all those guys that were kind of in that forefront of mountain biking. So I think that was the thing that really, inspired me. And I suppose the other thing too, I can still remember being in the bike shop in the 80s and getting the Torelli catalogs and seeing those pictures of all the, those little Italian factories, and you could buy a bike, and, the old Italian guy supposedly or hopefully made it for you, just the idea of making something, I suppose, and, learning that it happened, there were people doing it.
You talked about mountain biking. Seems like that area of the world where you were growing up was a place that people were latching onto it pretty early on.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that was when I worked in the bike shop in the 80s. We were selling mountain bikes, and then of course that late 80s, early 90s time period was when the absolutely mountain bike boom. You kind of felt like everybody back then. You bought a mountain bike, and 2 weeks later you went to a race, kind of a thing. It was just what we all did. So it was a pretty special time for sure.
Do you have a count for how many bikes you've built?
I don't. It's a little, Under my name, I'm around 2,000.
Okay.
But I've also done, it's been a number of years ago, but it's a little convoluted, right? Because do you count if you welded it, or that's only part of the process. But in the early days of the Speedwagon bikes that the guys up at Vanilla did, I welded those for 5 years, which was probably welding another couple hundred bikes there. And over the years, not much anymore, but I have done some that get sold under kind of other names. Like I said, I don't do much of that anymore. So it's funny that you asked that. When I was just looking the other day. When I started, I was building a lot of steel bikes, and it was a handful of mountain bikes, but for some reason, a lot of road bikes too. And I have to say that road bikes of 15 years ago were a whole lot easier to build because we didn't have things like disc brakes and all the other stuff that goes along with it. It was kind of like, we'll get your size dialed and your color, and we don't have to worry about are you going bike packing or putting the bags or how many water bottles and all that kind of things. There were some years back there. I never broke 150. There was one year where I was like 148 or 149, but I did a lot of years where I was building about 100 bikes a year as well. And then what happened to me, somewhere around 2010 or 12, is that things really started to shift to where it got turned into all titanium. And titanium bikes are a process that just takes a lot longer. So now the numbers have gone down. And I'm kind of settled into this place of about a bike a week is kind of a happy spot, with, as I said, with the more complicated bikes and most of them being titanium. And things have also shifted too. I used to sell through bike shops and dealers, and now I sell direct. So the bikes are usually complete. So, the whole process takes a little longer.
Wondering if there are some shifts, if you look back over the years, that are key shifts in frame building that ushered in a different way of doing it, or maybe radically changed it, or fundamentally changed it. Have those shifts happened since you've been involved?
We'll be right back.
I'm taking a moment here to remind you that we're putting together something special for next May, the Tour de Cure Pacific Northwest. It's the signature fundraising ride for the American Diabetes Association. I know it's early, but that's exactly the point. By signing up now, we'll have plenty of time to build excitement and turn this into a great launch party for the summer cycling season. I want to give a special shout out to Convergent Wealth for sponsoring our team jerseys. Thanks to Convergent, Team Cycling Over 60 is going to stand out with custom jerseys and make a powerful statement that vitality means staying active as you age. Head over to tour.diabetes.org/team/CO60 and sign up for the ride. You can find that link in the show notes. And if you're listening from outside the Pacific Northwest, consider this your invitation to come experience some of the most beautiful cycling routes in the country. It's going to be our spring celebration of everything we love about cycling and the enduring joy that it brings to our lives, no matter our age. Let's come together to make this a great event with a purpose.
Well, I think that they have, but one of the never-ending battles is operating like I do and so many of my friends that are just one-person operations. A lot of times it's hard to, it's technically hard to act like a larger company that has a production line, if that makes sense. So, of course things have changed, standard have changed, things are constantly evolving. But the first handful of bikes I built were mostly lugged and brazed, and then quickly I moved into TIG welding, and so now everything I do is TIG welded, and that's kind of what works for me. The example might be like, in titanium, we're seeing a lot of 3D printed parts right now, and it's not to say there's anything wrong with them. It's not necessarily my style yet. I won't say never, but, so far it just hasn't been something that has really appealed to me. I suppose the biggest one would probably be the carbon bikes, right? As that really started to get popular, I don't even know, what was it, probably, in my sphere, it was probably, around 20. We used to, in my early days, we did bikes that were, steel front ends with carbon rear ends, and then we did that for a few years, it seemed like. Then all of a sudden there were these full carbon bikes, and it was like, if you want carbon, just go get a carbon bike. It doesn't make any sense to kind of mix and match, really, per se. So, I think the carbon bikes would be the biggest one that I would point out as changed things probably in the last, say, 20, 25 years.
Well, I have a carbon fiber bike, but sometimes I wonder about it. It feels to me like you look at what professionals ride, and what they're doing is so different than what I'm doing. It's almost like, it's a different, the bike can be a totally different machine than the machine that I need. And I see carbon fiber maybe as being part of that. If I'm getting a new bike at the end of every season or sooner, then carbon maybe makes sense to me, but I don't know that I totally feel like that's the case for me now.
I wouldn't badmouth any of the materials. They all do something well, right? I mean, what carbon does really well is it's super light. It is interesting to just watch the kind of the evolution and how things change. And ultimately, I think the biggest thing is what do you want out of your ride? I mean, if you're a racer and you're looking to save every last second, probably the carbon is going to make sense. But, what I find is that a lot of people that come to me for, usually titanium bikes these days, but even steel bikes are, maybe somebody, an enthusiast that's looking for kind of an all-day comfort thing. I mean, there was a funny point in time for me about 2010 or 11 or 12, somewhere in there. I had this, when the shift to a lot of titanium bikes really happened to me, I started getting a lot of these folks that wanted titanium bikes to train on, and they were saving their carbon bikes for race day, and I don't know whether that's needed or necessary, but it was an interesting thing that they felt that they wanted to do. So, but yeah, I think, there at the end of the day, everything has a dramatically different ride quality and potentially a lifespan and all that kind of thing. So I think the important thing for folks is just to, decide what works for them.
You mentioned TIG welding, and I am not a welder, and I hear the term TIG welding a lot. First of all, are you still teaching TIG welding?
So I was, my time in teaching at United Bicycle Institute ended, what was it? I think it was in 21 or 22 when they, unfortunately, after COVID, they just, the frame building classes didn't survive at UBI, so they kind of shut those down. So for the last few years, I have not officially been teaching frame building and or welding. But although there's a new folks starting up in Portland, Firsthand Frame Building, and we've been in contact, so it'll be interesting to see if I get back to doing some of it up there. But yeah, so I did basically what my history there is that I, in 99, and by the way, it was at UBI. So I went to work at UBI in 99 as a mechanics instructor, and then it was there. They were also teaching frame building classes at the time, so it made sense, the mechanics instructors could also help out in those classes. And so it was during that time when I really, started building bikes. And, for me, after I built my first one, it was like every night and weekend, I just couldn't get enough, I just the next one. And so that was when I learned how to weld and specifically weld bikes. And so after a number of years of that, I don't even know, it probably wasn't until 2000, 5, 6, 7, or 8, till I had a bunch of years behind me that I did start really teaching and helping out in the frame building classes at UBI. And then kind of, I suppose, for about the last, 16, 18-ish years, we would go back to UBI, a time or two a year and kind of be what they call the guest instructor. So for their TIG welding classes, both in steel and titanium.
When I hear TIG welding, what should come to mind? What is it? What's it referred to? There are a lot of different kinds of welding, or
there are, yeah. And so TIG stands for tungsten inert gas, and so the tungsten is a tungsten electrode, and then the inert gas that gets used is argon. So the interesting thing about TIG welding is it's a little bit more of a dynamic process than the guy who might weld the bumper on your car or put a muffler on your car. Because what happens with TIG welding is you have a torch in one hand, you have filler wire in the other, and in the bicycle world, usually we're going to operate the power at our foot. So you've got two hands and one foot going. And this is basically, it's welding, so you're essentially going to be in the dark. So it's a skill that, it takes most of us a while to get good at it, and I even maintain that I'm the better you get, the better you want to be. So there's at this point I've been welding for almost 27 years, and I still want to be better. So it's just and it's the way that most bikes are put together. Maybe a department store bike might be MIG welded, but yeah, most of them are going to be TIG welded.
There's this interesting dynamic in my household. My wife is a dentist,
Okay.
And so we'll be watching a movie, and then she can't help but kind of comment on the teeth of the actors in the film.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, with the kind of experience you have, do you see welds and comment on them in your mind?
Oh, of course. I mean, we do. We all do. And what's really interesting to me, and it's interesting that you say that, because just in the last few weeks, I've been helping some guys that are making some electric motorcycles, and so I've been welding some frames for them. And I would say their standard of their visual standard is lower than what bicycle people expect. It's really interesting how, some of the best welds I think you'll ever see are going to be on a bicycle, because there's nothing else to look at, right? It's not like a car or a motorcycle or things that have other things that are going to draw your eye away. It's a bicycle frame that, you're going to study it to the nth degree. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we all work really hard to do the best we can, because we're going to be pretty criticized. And then it's interesting for me too, because one of my just maybe a casual hobby or something, I love airplanes as well. And so I've gone to air shows, and I visited an air show a couple of years ago, and there was an airframe that was partially, it was in progress, and the standards were not even as good as far as the fitting, how well the tubes fit. I mean, they were not nearly as good as what we require in bicycles.
I don't know how I feel about that. That's
well, I think that the reality is that in bicycles we use really thin tubes, so things have to be really good. And then the other part of it, I think, is that what so many, backseat welding critics, so to speak, for lack of a better term, don't realize is a pretty weld may or may not be a strong one. And what most of us are looking for is something that's even, and the spacing between the puddles, or even all those kinds of things. So it's anyhow, but yeah, entertaining for sure.
Is frame building, you think, still capturing the imagination of younger people? Are there new builders coming on? Is it something that's going away? What do you think about that?
It's a tough one for me. And behind the scenes, so many of us builders are really good friends. I have bike builder friends that we talk every week, and most of them, of course, are my friends. We're a similar age. So, I think that there is, but through my lens overall, I don't see, unfortunately, I don't see a whole lot of young people that are into bikes. There's maybe little patches here and there, but recently, I find myself, building bikes, I would say most of it, maybe some 30-somethings, but a whole lot of 40 and 50-somethings, even 60s, and a year or so ago, I was talking to a guy, and I looked at his order from, oh my God, you're 23 years old. I don't know I can't tell you last time I built the bike for somebody as young as you are. That's amazing, and I think bikes in general, unfortunately, I don't see the appeal to be as broad as when I was that age, if that makes sense. We do see, obviously if you go to the show like at Made or something, of course there seems to be a lot of younger folks into building bikes, but how broad is that? I don't know. It doesn't feel, in my world, it doesn't feel very broad.
It's a really interesting dynamic. I don't have that much connection with younger people, but it'd be interesting to see how that trend goes for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm curious to see where it all goes. It's hard to say.
Can you talk about the differences and maybe, what people should think about? Like, if we're just looking at the difference between a steel frame and a titanium frame, how would you explain those differences?
Well, so between steel and titanium, the benefits of titanium are that it's going to be lighter and you don't have to worry about, rust or corrosion. So it is a little more durable in that sense, but it also is going to be in most terms, it's going to be somewhere around $1,000 to $1,500 more, kind of comparing apples to apples. To me, the ride at the end of the day is always going to be the most important, but I would say out of all the materials, steel and titanium are going to be the most similar. if that makes sense. I mean, what I tend to find is that people who like steel usually love titanium because they're looking for that kind of that resilient, springy ride, if that makes sense. Versus if somebody says, oh, I love how a carbon bike rides, well, that person might be better served by an aluminum bike. But at the end of the day, I think it's the ride quality and, potentially the budget. It's interesting in my little world. I used to really just play the middle a lot, just say, hey, you got to make your own decision. I can't really make it for you. But I feel like at this stage of the game, I've come to the point where my 2 cents to most of my customers is like, if the budget allows, I do think titanium is the better way to go just over the long haul.
I'm thinking you're typically working with people that are experienced cyclists. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, I would say generally enthusiasts. I mean, over the years, I've done some bikes for racers, and of course, I've done last couple of years, I've done a couple step throughs or, type frames and things like that. So it is a mix. I would say it's kind of a mix of enthusiasts. Mixed in there somewhere is going to be some really short and some really tall people. And then, people that maybe just can't find what they want off the shelf, so to speak, right, in the local bike shop, something that the big manufacturers aren't making. And I actually have always felt or feel that more and more is that as small builders, we tend to fill those kind of gaps that, maybe there's 10 or 20 or 100 bikes with rim brakes that people want this year, but there's not 10,000, so there's no big company that's going to want to do a production run, but the small builders can pick up the slack, so to speak.
I think I read someplace that you had worked with Columbus Tubing. Did I get that right?
Well, I've always just been a huge fan. I've never actually specifically worked with Columbus. I've always just been a huge fan of their tubes, which is kind of funny, I will admit, and it probably goes back to my when I was a kid and looking at bikes and that's one of the questions, well, what's the tubing? And, it kind of matters, but maybe it does or doesn't. But we always looked for that little Columbus sticker, on the bike. And we always wanted to know what was the tubing it was made out of. And then, when I started building bikes, in my first few years, there was a lot of kind of experimentation and playing around with things and what I liked and what I didn't like. And I used tubing from all the different manufacturers. And I just found the Columbus tubes to be my favorite. I mean, both in the shapes that they do and the surface finish and all that kind of stuff. So just been a fan of their tubing for sure. Not to say that, quite honestly, at this stage of the game, it's not that all the companies, the reputable companies that are making tubes, Reynolds and Dedichai, and those are the kind of the big ones these days, at least in the steel world, they all make good stuff. But, it's kind of Chevy or Ford type situation, I suppose.
I want to talk about frame geometry a bit. I don't have, the ability to kind of look at a bike and say, okay, this frame is kind of this way, so therefore it's going to maneuver this way, or it's going to be comfortable or whatever. I just don't have an innate nature of, how changes in frame geometry really affect qualities.
Handling, sure.
But how important is frame geometry when someone's looking at getting something to, that they're going to really enjoy?
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be important, and it's going to be important that if somebody's working with a small builder, that the builder understands, what you're looking for. And what I always find myself, because the really common thing for me is people come to me and they want the Swiss Army knife, right? They want to do bike packing, and I want a super fast road bike, and, I want something to commute to work on, and, and it's like, well, that's not really possible. So what I find myself asking people is like, let's be honest with ourselves. And what we want to do is we want to design the bike to be, the best we can for the way it's going to get used most of the time, right? And then the other things just fall into place. If it's going to be mostly a gravel bike, but occasionally it's going to go bike packing, we're going to focus a little more on that. So it is, ultimately it's making sure that the bike is suitable for the terrain where it's going to be mostly used, I guess is the way I would describe it. So, once again, if it's going to be used a lot on gravel and kind of more single track, you want a bike that's a little more stable than, say, if it's a road bike that's going to get raced in criteriums, where you would want something that was, a little more responsive or easy to kind of flick around, right? And And what I would say, I think, although it can be daunting, there's, bicycle evolution has been going on for a really long, about 150 years or something. I think at this point, maybe not quite 150, but 125 or something. And so what we do find is that we all make changes. We're still, I would say there's almost like some industry norms, some ranges that we still end up working within. And that was actually one of the first things I did when I started building bikes was of course I thought I was going to reinvent the wheel. And so, I built bikes of lots of different designs, and you quickly figure out why we are where we are as far as bike designs and angles and things like that go. So I guess to kind of wrap it up, the most important thing is to know where the bike is going to get used, and then the geometry kind of match that, if that makes sense.
In the 3 years that I've gotten back on the bike and gotten serious about spending time on the bike and making it my primary form of recreation and activity and all that, my opinion is that there isn't such a thing as, a bicycle. There's more than one thing. And if you're going to really enjoy cycling, then, as much as your spouse might not want to hear this, you're going to need more than one bike. I just think, if you look at mountain biking versus road biking, you obviously, are like, okay, those are two different things, but I think there's, in a lot of ways, there's different kind of cycling that require different bikes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's, of course, it's not that we can't do it all on one bike, but those of us that are enthusiasts are like, well, this is fun, but it might be more fun if I add X, Y, or Z, right?
Yes.
So no, I do agree with you that if you're, if you're looking to kind of enjoy a lot of different aspects of cycling, it is truly hard to have one bike that does it all. And that's, as I said, that's the most common request that I get. And I just have to, kind of tone people down and like, okay, well, once again, what we really have to do here is be honest with ourselves and how is the bike going to get used most of the time. And we have to, we kind of have to start with it.
I think it's really healthy to think about the bicycle as, different for different applications, because I don't want someone to look at my bike that I use on the road and I try to get as much power as I can out of that bike. I don't want them to look at that and think that's a bicycle, because for them, a bicycle might be something, it's more of a beach cruiser with a basket on it that they're going to ride
absolutely
to pick up groceries, and so I think it's really healthy to think of it as different, really different for different applications.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And well, and especially any of us that have, bikes that are whatever enthusiast level bikes that cost a bit these days, that's probably not the thing that you want to take down to get frozen yogurt with your kids or, get groceries, so, not the thing you want to have locked up on the curb.
So you talked about, figuring out how the bike is going to get used. And again, I think it'd be different having those conversations with someone that's just brand new into cycling versus, someone who's been an enthusiast for a while and is coming in and having that conversation. I'm wondering, how does that conversation go? How do you suss out how they're going to use the bike?
So typically I would ask questions like, what are your normal rides? And usually that's a combination of, what are the mileages? What are you doing on a regular basis? Are you riding, 20, 50, 100 miles? What's the terrain like? A lot of the other thing for me too, in this day and age, for many years now, I seem to do a lot of kind of the gravel and the all-road style bikes. So a lot of that discussion, we talk about tire size because, of course, the rougher the area that somebody's riding, usually the wider the tires they want to go. So all those things kind of help make those decisions. And I would say, I mean, if I'm being honest, that most of the people that come to me they're enthusiasts. You know, they've spent way too many hours on forums and the internet and over researching every little detail that you could, and the other part of it, many of them even have had multiple custom bikes built for them before. So it is kind of pretty rare, other than the times that I think I would get folks that are maybe new to cycling is the ones that might, be some really interesting fits, right? So really small or really tall. But outside of that, I would say that, I mean, and the crazy thing with the internet is it's not uncommon these days for somebody to tell me about something that I haven't even heard of yet, and I've got to go look at it, because whatever the latest, greatest thing is that somebody's looking at.
That's interesting. I find that to be really interesting. How about for older riders? Do you see a lot of older riders, and how do you feel about people cycling later in life?
Yeah, I do, and I think it's great. And what we see is that typically when folks get older, I mean, one of my jokes is that nobody ever comes to me saying they want a longer reach and their handlebars lower. You know what I mean? It's like we're all getting older, and we all typically want a shorter reach and a more upright position. And I think it's phenomenal that folks ride their bikes into. One of my customers on my list that I was just talking to the other day, he's 78 and getting a new bike, so I think it's really, really impressive for those folks that just, they stay on their bikes, but very much so that what we find is that the fit is all about comfort and less about, looking like the next pro racer, you know what I mean? Which in my day was Greg LeMond or Lance Armstrong. We've lost we don't really care about those positions anymore. We just want to be comfortable and be able to go out and ride.
You mentioned the Made Bike Show that happens in Portland.
Mm-hmm.
What I saw is that it's considered the world's largest handmade bike show with over 200 builders.
I don't know. There's 200 builders. I think 200 brands is what they say.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, it's the gay world that I play in.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
And you're down in Ashland, and you've exhibited at Made. Is there something about Oregon that is like a frame builder production state?
Yeah. Well, so what I would say about shows like Made is, so years previous, there was one called the North American Handmade Show. And our little industry of, people making bikes for people, whatever we want to call it, bespoke, handmade, there's lots of different terms for it. It's a pretty niche-y industry, right? The people that are going to want to go are the ones that are really into it. So the Made Show came about as a result of the North American Handmade Show no longer happening. And many of the builders there, keep in mind, are not even from the local area. And they'll travel. Well, I know one of the guys, Rizzo Cycles, Ruben, has traveled from Spain to come to the Made Show. So while I would say that we do have a pretty high percentage of builders here in the Pacific Northwest, a show like Made, builders will travel to just because there's not many shows for builders, if that makes sense, that highlight builders, like in that regard. So yeah, but between, I don't know, Portland's still got a ton of builders, and even down here in Southern Oregon, per capita, we've got a bunch too. And I would say, a lot of that is can be contributed to UBI and the frame building classes that they taught for so many years. Outside of that, I guess I don't. One of the stories that I've told many times is that, so in my early days, there used to be the Seattle Bike Show. I don't know if they still do that anymore. And I used to go up to that, and I was always blown away. You get like 10,000 people or something. It was always really impressive, and all facets of cycling and everything. And then there were some guys that did a show down in San Diego, and I thought, oh my gosh, the San Diego show, that's going to be crazy, isn't it? The weather down there is so beautiful, and if in the Pacific Northwest we get, in Seattle we get so many people, we're going to get umpteen million or 100 more down in San Diego. And what I was quickly reminded of when I was down in San Diego was in really talking to people that show, it was a number of years ago now, it's really slow. And so it was so slow that I just started talking to people, and I said, man, it's, where do you guys go to ride? And they all said, oh, we have to drive here, we drive here, and we drive there. And they were just like, yeah, we have no infrastructure. And I was just so reminded that, so much of it, for better or worse, I think it's such a cultural thing, right? If you have infrastructure and you have good places to ride, it's almost, independent of the weather to some degree. We'll get dressed and just go out and do it. So, I don't know what it is about our area up here that makes us all want to ride bikes, but I think it's wonderful.
Well, I think it's an outdoor thing, and I think people up here, one of the things they love about the Northwest, including me, is that it's beautiful outdoors.
Exactly, yeah.
And then I think it's a great point that the infrastructure is a huge factor. And I've talked about this a number of times on the podcast. I think that at the federal level, there's a real lack of understanding about active transportation and active recreation and, pulling back a funding. And so I think that aspect of infrastructure is so important. And I think we need to figure out ways to continue to communicate the value in having infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and what I was kind of reminded of in Southern California too is how much there are car culture, and that is really kind of the predominant thing there. I mean, I do agree with you, and I know what I find myself. I mean, Ashland's only 20,000 people, but even around here, I find myself riding on the road less and less. I just feel like the amount of distracted drivers is more and more, so always looking for places to ride where that won't be an issue,
Yeah. If you get approached by someone, maybe even a young person,
hopefully,
hopefully in their 20s or something, and it says, I just love the concept of frame building. I just really want to do it. What would you say to them about, about it and what they might need to know, or,
Well, what I used to tell this when I taught at UBI, I guess what I always just told the students was, first things first. And so, build your first bike and, decide if you like the process. And if you do, build more so you can hopefully get good at it, and, and just see where it goes from there. Because it is, I mean, at this stage of the game, I've really come to grips with the fact that the bike industry is just not a place to make a lot of money. You know what I mean? It's an industry to have a lot of fun in, but the margins are just so low across the board, whether it's a small frame builder, whether it's your local bike shop, I mean, it's a tough place to be. So I had a guy stop by recently. He said, well, do you think this is a good business? I said, no, it's not a good business if you don't love bikes. Because, if all you're looking for is a paycheck, this is the worst thing in the world you could do. So, but if you love bikes and as I said, you build some bikes and you get into it. And I mean, it's super rewarding. I still, thousands of bikes into it, and I still enjoy the process. Before we got on this morning, I was welding some chainstays on a titanium road bike, or all road bike, I guess. And that's never gotten old for me. But running a small business is a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I've always operated by myself. So, I think one of the things for me personally is I always had this idea that when I was younger, that I would work really hard for the first X number of years, and then it would kind of get easier. And well, that never happens, So you just got to keep pushing until you can't push anymore. But yeah, I think the most important thing that's got to come first is the bikes and, those skills, because those are probably, if somebody's just getting into it, is the actual skills of making the bike are going to be, one of the big deficits from the get-go. So that's a good place to start. And I honestly tell people it's, if you have a day job and you want a really fun hobby, I mean, it could be an amazing hobby, and that's what we see too. I think, at a lot of the folks out there are just maybe it's their part-time job or their hobby or, just a really serious hobby. And that's great too.
I think it's like that with a lot of things that are, there's an art form to it. And I think that's the same thing with frame building.
Hmm. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a lot of skills, and the thing that I feel like I've learned over the years with frame building is, I mean, it's similar. At the end of the day, building metal bikes is metal fabrication, but it is different than, once again, the guy that's going to put the muffler on your car kind of a thing. I'm always really, really honest with folks too, because I'm like, I'm a one trick pony. I mean, I learned how to work with metal and weld so I could build bikes. If you asked me to build a metal workbench, I mean, I could do it, but there's a whole lot of people out there that could do it probably faster and better than I could, So go find those people if that's what you want to have done.
You do more than the frame, and you put the bikes together. So I was interested to get your comments on this. I keep hearing that if you're going to do one thing to upgrade your bike, put better wheels on it. Do you think that that's the right thing to say?
Yeah, I think that rotational weight's always a big one, right? And of course, you have to figure out where you're starting from and where you might be able to go to, right? But if you're, kind of for performance, something that you're going to feel when you stomp on the pedals, that's one of the things that, of course, in my world, a lot of people do that. I mean, they're counting grams in every step of the way. But, a nice light set of wheels, a light set of tires, if you can drop a pound of rotational weight, that's something that you're going to feel, when you stomp on the pedals. So I would say it has the potential to be a good upgrade, right? But you have to look at what you've got currently to make sure that you're gonna lose some weight.
Right. And in my case, I mean, I have pounds that I can shed still, on
yeah,
me.
Of course.
So that makes a big difference.
Yeah. Of course, and nobody ever wants to hear that.
Right.
I'm always a little entertained that some of the biggest riders seem to be the ones that are most interested in shaving weight on the bike, and it's like, just like you say, it doesn't make any sense. But I think at the end of the day, we're, as riders, right, we all have different ideas of what we're after. Are we chasing a Strava section, or do we just want to go for a bike ride?
Right.
And it's interesting, the term I always use a lot. So when I was younger, I did race a lot, both on mountain bikes and road bikes, and did endurance kind of racing and stuff. And then then had kids, and I've always ridden bikes over the years. But my joke now is that my 26-year-old self would be pretty embarrassed, right? Because I don't ride with any technology at all. To me, riding a bike these days, I don't really care how far I go. I just want to get the time to go for a bike ride. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't really, I mean, I like to go out there and get a good workout and enjoy the scenery and everything, but I don't I don't use any technology, which drives a lot of my friends nuts.
I was connected to you, or how I found
Mm-hmm.
out about you is through Erin, who
Mm-hmm.
has one of your bikes. And if people want to know more about Erin, and I think her story is a great story, on May 29th of this year, I did an episode with Erin where she talked about her India bike trip, and I just thought it was epic, and so people can learn more about her and that trip by listening to that episode. She is quite small.
Yeah, she is super small. Yeah, and that was a pretty good example of somebody who kind of requires a custom bike. I don't think she's much over 5 foot tall. And what tends to happen for folks that are on the shorter side like that is they end, basically the size of bike that they fit on is kind of a kid's bike, which is pretty low quality. So Erin actually was turned on to me by her local bike shop up in Eugene, who I had worked with a number of times, and they do a lot of fitting. And this is a pretty common one too, is because I actually very rarely meet my customers face to face. My bikes go all over the United States, but they do go all over the world. I mean, I've shipped bikes to Europe and Australia and Japan, and so it's not the most common thing, or actually it's the least common thing that I meet people face to face. So the really common thing was that folks would go somewhere and have a fitting done, maybe at a bike shop, maybe at a fit studio, and then provide me with that information. And I remember what was so different about with Erin's is as soon as I got that fit information, I had to kind of do a drawing of a bike to make sure that it was even buildable, if that makes sense, because at 5 foot tall, making the tire, basically having all the clearances correct becomes a challenge for sure. But we were able to do it. And she took that bike and had an amazing adventure, which was super cool.
I mean, it's to enable someone like her, who is getting on a bike, later in life to have a tool that she can really enjoy riding. That's fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
And then the other side of that is someone that's really tall. I'm wondering if you could talk about what are some of the considerations that go in there?
Well, usually the considerations is just, are we going to have parts that work? I mean, things like, is the steer tube on the fork going to be long enough, or are there cranks long enough, or those are the issues. Years ago, I built some bikes for professional baseball or basketball players that were all like 6'8" plus, and so then it's the kind of the reverse, similar issues but different than the really small folks, And as I said early on, those two kind of demographics, so to speak, are definitely a portion of what I do every year.
If you have somebody that's tall and big, I'm thinking about basketball players. They're, they're athletes. They're usually not, really light people. Do you have to look for special tubing? Do you reinforce tubing in some way? How do you manage that weight?
Yeah. So they would, right? So a lighter rider is going to get smaller diameter, thinner tubing, and a bigger rider is going to need larger diameter, thicker tubing. So yeah, that's basically kind of the difference. And, and the other, on that same note, you could have somebody who's 5'10" who rides a 56 centimeter bike, and one rider is going to be 140 and the other is going to be 210 pounds. So although those two bikes are the same size, they would be built very differently, the tube diameters and wall thicknesses.
As you're looking ahead, do you see advances that are going to impact frame building? Where do you see frame building going?
That's a tough one. I honestly don't know. I've been in the bike industry, as I said, since the mid '80s, and I've seen, lots of things come and go, and the bike industry seems to be really good at that, and things get recycled every 20 or 30 years or whatever. And I would say that a lot of those kind of advances, so to speak, or changes in standards kind of drive the bikes that we build, if that makes sense. As far as how it's going to change small frame builders, I honestly don't know. I'm curious to see if this kind of thing will be taken up by the generations and generations, and at the end of the day, can they make it a business and survive on it? Which I don't know. As things get more production oriented and more, we can go on Amazon and have something here tomorrow, and all those kinds of things that are pretty counter to what the way that small builders operate. So
I just read an article that was in Bicycle Retailer. Mm-hmm. It's talking about legislation called U.S. Bicycle Production and Assembly Act, bipartisan legislation designed to eliminate the primary cost barrier that prevents large-scale bicycle assembly and manufacturing from returning to the United States. Mm-hmm. To me, it seems like large-scale manufacturing, it's already gone. It's hard for me to imagine, how it could come back.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if they could, because I haven't seen that article specifically, but it's been interesting to follow a lot of that stuff lately, and try and understand what was once produced here that's now no longer is. And companies like Trek and Cannondale did build a lot in the U.S., and I think, even Huffy did it over the years, but I don't think we've had large scale bicycle production I mean, I still remember when I was in the bike shop in the 80s and the Shikis or whatever they were, that big sticker on the top of the C-tube said designed in the USA, and then the little teeny one down at the bottom said made in Taiwan,
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, of course it would be wonderful, and it'd be great if it happens and we can figure out how to make it happen. But it's an interesting one to try and comprehend based on, what we know about the cost of labor and all those kinds of things. And the other thing I would say too, I mean, is the small builders, we're doing something a little bit different than a big production facility is, which is kind of one of our struggles is, a lot of people will, of course, everybody wants something tomorrow, and, it's hard, when you're one person doing everything one at a time, and every single one is different, that doesn't really lend itself to production very well, and so, I mean, this, hopefully the small builders can kind of operate even if we have large scale production here, but I guess I'll just have to wait and see.
Well, I think that there would be a gap closed, especially in the beginning, between the cost of, a bike from a large manufacturer and a custom-made bike. Because you're talking about supply chain infrastructure that has been developed for decades now in some of these areas. And man, it'd be super tough to do that here, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I be interesting to see if it could work. And I mean, there was a place near Portland for a lot of years called Anodizing Ink. Well, they went under a few different names, but they would do, say you had a brand and you went with them and you went to them and you said, I need, 50 of this size and 50 of this size and 50 of this size, and they would build those for you. But they went through a couple of iterations, and they're no longer in existence. It's a tricky thing. I mean, I heard something recently too, and it's like, okay, so if if somebody's, the average consumer is, there's a bike made in China for $100 and there's a bike made in the U.S. for $1,000, what do you think most people are going to go for?
Yeah,
and it's an unfortunate part of it,
Well, I'm going to be following it. It'll be interesting to see, but...
Oh, for sure. No, absolutely.
Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Like I said, I enjoy the bike as a machine. And, there's a lot of things about how bikes are made and how frames are made and frame geometry and all that stuff that I don't know that much about. And I just really appreciated the conversation and having you give us a view of your world as a frame builder.
Yeah, it was definitely fun to share today, and I hope that folks picked up something. And yeah, maybe we'll do it again someday.
I'd look forward to it. All right, take care now. There is a side of me that would love to get up in the morning and go out to a shop and make bikes all day. Now, that isn't really a possibility for someone with my lack of skills. Talking to Mike, I get a little bit disappointed that small frame builders just can't compete with large manufacturers. I do realize that it's like that with so many things these days. When I asked Mike where he sees frame building going in the future, he laughed a lot. He said, quote, I honestly don't know. That is interesting to me. I read that as he just got used to doing his thing regardless of the temporary changes that are happening around him. No matter what is happening, I hope that Mike can keep going with building frames and putting bikes together as long as he wants. I want to ask you to consider coming and visiting the gorgeous Pacific Northwest and ride with us on May 2nd. I really think that we are going to have a really fun time together riding around Lake Washington. If there's even a chance that you can join us, consider registering for the team. Worst case scenario, you are giving a year-end donation to the American Diabetes Association and helping to fuel their work. You can find the Cycling Over 60 team by going to tourtocure.org and searching for Cycling Over 60. I hope you have a great week of cycling coming up. And remember, age is just a gear change.